This is The World This Weekend. Good evening, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Tonight, the suspected Chinese spy balloon shot down in the U.S.
Perhaps the Chinese authorities wanted the balloon to be seen.
Also tonight, encouraging Black Canadians to add their samples to the National Stem Cell Registry.
Because we had such severe underrepresentation, the odds were stacked against me.
And Yazidis in Canada fear the worst after a court orders the repatriation of suspected ISIS fighters.
A lot of them just broke down into tears because they thought this news was completely unbelievable. It can't be true.
That's later, but first. The suspected Chinese spy balloon has been popped. The U.S. military shot it down this afternoon off the South Carolina coast, and recovery efforts for the debris are underway. The balloon was first seen above Montana on Wednesday after flying over Alaska and Canada. It has captured the public's imagination, and as Chris Reyes reports, it's also set off a diplomatic row between Washington and Beijing.
I told them to shoot it down.
A clear order from the President of the United States to shoot down what the U.S. government has identified as a Chinese spy balloon, first spotted earlier this week over Montana. President Biden said he gave the orders on Wednesday, but he was told to wait.
They decided, without doing damage to anyone on the ground, they decided that the best time to do that was as it got over water, outside within the 12-mile limit.
Video captured the balloon deflating and falling into the Atlantic off the coast of South Carolina, shot down by a missile Saturday afternoon. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration closed off airspace before the operation, grounding flights at 3 different airports in North and South Carolina.
And I want to compliment our aviators who did it, and we'll have more to report on this a little later.
Biden talked to reporters on his way to Camp David. He didn't answer questions on China. China has countered the U.S. accusation of spying, officially apologizing for what they called a weather research airship gone astray. The discovery of the balloon prompted U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to cancel his visit this Sunday to Beijing. Dexter Roberts is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Indo-Pacific Security Initiative.
It is a little puzzling that this happened right now. Why do this and therefore risk this visit that I think both sides have felt like is important, again, and putting a floor under the rapidly deteriorating bilateral relationship.
U.S. defense officials say the payload will now be investigated and that the balloon entered Canadian airspace Monday, then re-entered U.S. airspace. In a statement, Defense Minister Anita Anand confirmed that Canada was involved in the operation to shoot down the balloon, adding that Canada has been closely engaged with its U.S. counterparts on the decision and unequivocally supports the actions taken. The Pentagon says there are reports of another balloon moving through Latin America that they believe is also a Chinese surveillance device. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
To understand more about spy balloons, what they are, and why China would use them, I spoke to Arthur Holland Michel. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs and an expert on emerging surveillance technologies. I started by asking him if a Chinese spy balloon, like the one that was over the U.S., is really as unsophisticated as it looks.
That all depends on what the balloon is carrying. These might be very, very high-powered cameras or radar. They may be signals intelligence systems that collect electronic data. And in that sense, this could be a very, very modern and sophisticated surveillance device. Since the Cold War, the United States has taken great pains to protect its most sensitive national security assets from aerial observation. So it would be very surprising to me if this balloon was able to collect sensitive information about these very, very fortified sites that China, again, couldn't have already picked up with satellites.
What would be the point of using something that's so obvious, especially when you think that China could just be using satellites?
So my personal theory is that perhaps the Chinese authorities wanted the balloon to be seen. You know, we know that it probably couldn't have collected any valuable intelligence that China couldn't already have collected by other means. We also know that Chinese authorities would have known that there was a very high likelihood that it would have been spotted. The third thing that we know is that balloons are frightening. They can capture the public imagination in a very, very effective way. I mean, after all, that's why we're talking about the balloon today. And so in that sense, to me, it feels like perhaps this could be a bit of an intentional provocation without also being so provocative that it would, spark a war. And if it indeed was a ploy to have an emotional and psychological impact, it seems to have been very effective in that regard. It's now dominated the news cycle for 2 days and counting, and that is a pretty significant sort of strategic benefit if you think about it.
Of that first balloon, Beijing said it's a civilian airship. It was used mainly for weather research, and it blew off course. Is it possible that's just what it is?
It is true that these types of balloons can be used for collecting scientific data. The second thing that we know is that claiming that a surveillance device is actually a scientific experiment is one of the oldest tricks in the playbook. So, you have to take these claims with a fairly hefty grain of salt, especially because if it was just an innocent, scientific experiment that went horribly wrong, one imagines that Chinese authorities would have alerted their counterparts in the US and Canada, much, much sooner, and steps would have been taken to, draw it back or to work some kind of arrangement out. And that simply hasn't happened. So I must say, I, like many others, am rather skeptical of that Chinese claim.
Arthur, it's a fascinating story. As you say, it's captured our attention, and there's still so much more to come. Thank you for speaking with us about it.
Always a pleasure.
Arthur Holland-Michel is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. He spoke to us earlier today from Barcelona, Spain. Canada's National Stem Cell Registry is getting some desperately needed diversity, with hundreds of Black Torontonians adding their samples today. It's part of an event that celebrates Black History Month by addressing the underrepresentation of Black stem cell donors, which many say is caused by historic racist practices. Philip Lee Shannock tells us why it's so important and about the woman who inspired today's event.
10 years ago, Dorothy Vernon Brown was diagnosed with leukemia. After cancer treatments failed, doctors told her there were few options.
My chance of survival meant I needed a stem cell transplant.
But because there were so few Black donors on the stem cell registry, only 2% compared to 66% of the white population, her chances of finding a match were low.
Because we had such severe underrepresentation, the odds were stacked against me.
The community rallied and started the donor drive for Dorothy. Today, Vernon Brown is a cancer survivor, but she wants the momentum to continue so others will have a fighting chance. She says a disproportionately higher number of people in the Black community die from leukemia.
Numbers matter. We need a large donor pool in order to give patients like me an opportunity to find their perfect match so they can be alive. It's simple.
Omi Sheree Dryden teaches Black Canadian Studies at the Dalhousie School of Medicine in Halifax. She says after the tainted blood crisis in the 1990s, when some people contracted HIV and hepatitis C from contaminated blood products, some racialized communities were discouraged from donating.
But in fact, they focused on all of continental Africa as a problem. If you were born there or had sex with anybody that was there, that meant you were a danger to the blood system.
She says that stigma remains, and it will take outreach and education to counter it.
We are going to do it!
Tanya McKenzie gets a room full of would-be donors fired up at First Baptist Church in Toronto. She gives him instructions on how to give a sample.
So swab each corner of your mouth.
A quick swab of the cheek and new potential donors are added to the National Stem Cell Registry. They're hoping to add 5,000 black people at events like this during Black History Month. If there's a match, their stem cells could help treat leukemia, blood disorders like aplastic anemia and sickle cell anemia. Former NBA player Denham Brown is the head coach of Halton Prep basketball. He brought a group of his players as a team-building exercise. Player DeAndre Hamilton hopes to lead by example.
If one person were to join and other people see multiple people go in, then it will be a larger group and larger community. And if we just come in as a community, a lot of people, it will be a lot better.
And he says it will mean more people in his community will have access to life-saving treatments. Philip Lishanok, CBC News, Toronto.
Yazidis in Canada say they are now living in fear and anxiety. A court recently ordered Ottawa to repatriate suspected members of ISIS now detained in Syria. The terror group waged a brutal campaign of genocide against the Yazidis in 2014, killing thousands. And as survivors attempt to reunite their families and recover from years of trauma, news that alleged ISIS members could be coming to Canada has set them reeling. Evan Dyer reports.
She's saying, when I look at the photos, I remember how happy we were when we took them, and everyone was around, and we were a big family. We had everything we needed. And now when I look around me, there's nobody.
Photos are all that Huda Al-Hamid has left of her parents, her elder brother, and her life before August 2014, when ISIS arrived in her village bent on destroying the Yazidi people.
She feels like she's here physically, but her heart, her soul, her mind, everything is still back home. She was ripped out of her parents' arms, and her parents are presumed dead right now.
Yazidis aren't Muslims, but practice their own ancient religion. That was what made them a target for ISIS.
They started targeting small towns and villages, primarily populated by the Yazidi community. They went in, they separated women and girls. The elders were just killed on the spot. Men and boys were taken to be converted and then shot and killed.
Thousands of women and girls as young as 10 were sold as sex slaves to ISIS members. Others were trafficked to neighboring countries. Huda and her sisters were eventually taken to a hall in Mosul, where they were sold to ISIS fighters.
I was 17 years old when I was taken captive, and I was in captivity for 3 years. And on a daily basis, it was just torture and rape and reselling like cattle.
It was years before Huda learned her sisters had survived ISIS slavery and now live in refugee camps. For 3 years, she's been trying to bring them to Canada.
That's all I could really ask for, is to be reunited with my sisters here. We've submitted the paperwork for family reunification, but for almost 3 years now, we have yet to hear anything.
Huda took it hard when she heard a court had ordered that alleged members of ISIS who hold Canadian passports be returned to Canada.
When I first heard the news, I felt the strength leave my body. I had to sit down right away.
Canada was one of the first countries to respond to the plight of the Yazidis.
Jamila Nasso heads the Canadian Yazidi Association.
And they couldn't be any more happy or grateful that they would come to a country like Canada where they could feel safe and protected, and a country who stood for all these great values of freedom, of rights, of justice, of accountability.
The belief that Canada was a safe haven made the court order harder to take, she says.
A lot of them just broke down into tears because they thought this news was completely unbelievable. It can't be true. We have submitted applications for family reunification to reunite with our family members who were in ISIS captivity, and here they are bringing the perpetrators of these crimes to Canada, and they know in most cases that, you know, these folks will not face trial. The evidence is not here and the witnesses aren't here.
The Yazidis say they don't believe the Canadian court or government really understand the true nature of ISIS or the crimes it committed. For Huda, the thought of seeing a former member on the streets of Winnipeg brings on panic attacks. All she can hope for now, she says, is that her own sisters will receive the same consideration as alleged members of the group that kidnapped them. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ottawa.
When Giorgia Meloni won the Italian national election in September, many expressed alarm. She once led a party with neo-fascist origins, and there were concerns she would take the country to the far right. Meloni has now reached her first 100 days as Prime Minister, and as Megan Williams reports from Rome, those early fears appear to have vanished.
Saturday morning coffee in a bar in a residential neighborhood here in Rome, where two locals who say they would never vote for Giorgia Meloni give their take on how she's done so far.
Una ragazza che si è fatta completamente da sola.
I like the fact that she's made it completely on her own, says this man, that she's dropped her hateful rhetoric, and that she's turning into a decent statesman.
Preparata, una donna intelligente.
Prepared, intelligent, says this young woman. I don't agree with her politics, but she knows what she's doing.
Una persona che sa.
Last summer, Meloni was delivering fiery campaign speeches where she railed against political correctness, the so-called LGBT lobby, and useless EU bureaucrats. Then she was elected leader. Her first foreign trip to Brussels to reassure those very same bureaucrats that she would stick to the reforms promised by her predecessor, former EU banker Mario Draghi, in exchange for billions in EU post-COVID funds and grants. In contrast to her coalition members, the bombastic anti-migrant Matteo Salvini and Silvio Berlusconi, she's been low-key, serious, and compromised when needed. Political expert Cecilia Emma Sottilotta.
Compared to several of her predecessors, she did relatively well, much more sober in a sense. So in a way, she was much more careful.
But that doesn't mean Italy is in good shape. Its debt is mammoth, almost 150% of the GDP. And while Meloni has to carry out reforms for Italy to get its hands on the EU funds, many point out they're slow and inadequate.
The real problem in the country is actually the lack of structural change.
In the meantime, more than 1 million young people have left, fed up with the low salaries, red tape, and lack of future. As young Italians leave, Meloni has stuck to an anti-immigration policy that lets just tens of thousands of legal immigrants in a year, in a country with one of the oldest populations in the world. International affairs expert Natalie Tocci.
So on the one hand, it's that demographic decline that should make you have that rational conversation, but that is precisely the reason why you're not having it.
Tocci says Meloni may shore up political support by avoiding a serious discussion about increasing immigration. But Italy's economy and future will be all downhill. Megan Williams, CBC News, Rome.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Correctional Service Canada is launching a review into the use of Indigenous elders in prisons. The move comes after an internal audit concluded elder services are unable to meet the needs of Indigenous inmates. As Olivia Stefanovich reports, the findings are leading to calls for the federal agency to revamp the program.
The liaison told me the first day I started working there that nobody worked longer than 3 weeks.
Albert Dumont says he was hired by Correctional Service Canada to work with inmates on rehabilitation. But he says that word was rarely uttered during the 3 years he worked at the Millhaven Institute, a maximum security prison west of Kingston, Ontario.
He told me that they were young and violent and unpredictable, and that I had to watch not to get my throat slashed.
Dumont, an Algonquin elder from Kitigon-Zibi and Anishinaabeg First Nation in western Quebec, says he hopes an upcoming review of elder services will lead to changes. It comes after an internal audit found elders exhausted, overworked, along with flaws in the way they're selected.
So clearly, something is wrong.
Harry Laforme is a retired judge from the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation in Ontario. He says he's worried the Elders program is failing to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis inmates make up 32% of the prison population.
I blame the corrections system because they don't know how to measure the effectiveness. They don't even know what elders do.
Too often, corrections is deciding who is an elder.
Senator Kim Pate is a longtime social justice advocate for prisoner rights. She says the agency should involve Indigenous leadership in the decision-making and give elders more freedom to offer guidance.
I've seen individuals who have gone from being in segregation, literally losing their minds, in terms of mental health issues, work with an elder and start to move through the process and end up ultimately in the community. Unfortunately, there are far too few cases where that happens.
I felt for the inmates.
Despite his concerns, Dumont says working with inmates was meaningful.
We don't know what relative of ours might end up in prison. We all have a stake in how people are treated in prison, because it could be one of your loved ones someday.
Correctional Service Canada says it's looking to overhaul the entire elders program, from increasing staff to involving Indigenous communities in the way elders are chosen. It's expected to begin its review in the coming months, with the goal of implementing changes in 2024. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Ottawa.
A safe home in which to grow old. It should be a right. And for one transgender senior in Montreal, life has finally become much more secure. After struggling to find a senior's home to accept her, she's now found a welcoming place to live. But her story is sadly emblematic of the struggles trans people face as they grow older. Sarah Levitt brings us that story.
Sitting at the white grand piano in her senior's residence, Vanessa Frey says she's most in her element playing music. Now, not only does she have somewhere to perform, but she has a safe home as well. It hasn't always been the case. A trans senior, she says she's found herself in dangerous situations.
I had to leave where I was. I don't know if I should get into it, but I don't really want to. I had to leave where I was. It was not a good experience.
So at 69 years old, she turned to social workers for help. She was turned down at every senior's residence they tried.
I even asked them, you never dealt with this issue before? You never dealt with trans people before? You never dealt... And the answer was no.
Denying housing due to gender is illegal in Canada, but unless it's directly stated as the reason, it's hard to prove. Julien Rougerie works for the LGBTQ nonprofit Fondation Emergence.
The very vast majority of housing facilities for seniors are not inclusive to sexual and gender diversity.
Rougerie leads LGBTQ workshops for seniors' home residents and staff. Few sign up for them, even though advocates say it's a misconception that seniors are less open to gender and sexual diversity.
Sometimes the main obstacle that we face is not elder citizens, but it's institutions themselves. And sometimes I feel there might be a bit of a reluctance to acknowledge the fact that these people really exist.
Courtney Deekbrader is with British Columbia nonprofit Community. She says some gay seniors moving into homes go back into the closet, but that isn't as easy for trans people whose identity can be much more visible.
You know, for many people in the trans community, for years and years, they've been mistreated in institutional settings their whole lives. So just the idea of going into a facility can be extremely scary.
At Manoir de Casson, residents and staff have welcomed Frey warmly.
I still pinch myself. Honestly, I wake up in the morning, right, and I go like, wow.
Frey doesn't want to be an anomaly, though, and hopes her story highlights the needs of trans seniors across Canada. Sarah Levitt, CBC News, Montreal.
The 2023 Arctic Winter Games are coming to a close this evening. There have been so many outstanding athletes, including one very young hockey player who has proven herself to be a star in the making. She's so good on the ice, she's playing with teammates nearly twice her age. Juanita Taylor went to see the hockey prodigy and brings us this report.
It's game day for this team all the way from Nunavut at the 2023 Arctic Winter Games. And coach Jamie Sevigatar gives the girls a pep talk before they hit the ice.
This is an opportunity for many of you to shine.
And it's the first time at an Arctic Winter Games for Pangnaktuk's Jordan Macmer, just 11 years old.
I was so nervous. It was okay though.
Jordan is the youngest player Coach Savikadak selected for the under-20 team.
We call her the baby. Her skill, her determination, her commitment level to the game is something I haven't seen in a long time.
The older and more experienced girls took on a protective role with Jordan on and off the ice.
Finding out that she was the baby of the group, it was so stressful to make sure that she was okay and eating and well taken care of.
Honestly, she is so talented and she's so good at what she does that you couldn't even tell the difference.
But how did Jordan feel about that?
It felt good, and they were way older than me and they helped me a lot.
On the ice, Jordan's shyness disappears. Her dad, David Kilabak, is here to watch her play. He's also her coach at home.
A little emotional once she hit the ice, for the first time with her team. I have to say that.
Kilabak remembers her first skate. She was only 3 years old.
I kind of went like this and said, whoa, that's something. I could tell right away that she was a little bit different than other players.
There is no artificial ice in Pangnaktuk, so skaters have to wait until late January when ice can form inside the arena. Until then, Jordan practices on an outdoor rink built by her dad.
She does a lot of stuff behind her house, shooting and stick handling, and in the house as well.
At these games in Fort McMurray, they played hard but lost all 4 games. For kids in Pangnaktuk, Kilabak says Jordan is a role model.
A lot of kids look up to her back home, and so this can only help other players.
Most likely, Jordan will be selected to play at the next Arctic Winter Games for Team Nunavut in 2024. Juanita Taylor, CBC News, Fort McMurray, Alberta.
A thrilling moment at the Arctic Winter Games, Nunavut beating Alaska to win gold in under-18 male hockey with a CBC broadcast live in Inuktitut. Puujit Kusagak did the play-by-play.
It feels amazing to be part of something like this, it's history, and to do it in our language.
Kusagak is no stranger to the broadcast booth. He announced all of Team Canada's 2022 Olympic hockey games in Inuktitut. This time he was joined by color commentators Darren Ikakek and the CBC's Mary Tati.
I've never done this before. I'm really good with my Inuktitut language, so I was nervous, but I went through. So I was thinking first and last time, but maybe I want more.
I said, if they're going to talk, I can talk too.
As for the game itself, Kusagak says Nunavut controlled the play right from the beginning. It ended with a 4-1 victory and Nunavut's first gold medal in hockey. But it won't be its last.
It's been a long time coming. We've had a lot of close teams, but this team has been building up to this for probably 10, 12 years. The biggest thing is that Nunavut now expects medals in hockey, which would have never happened years ago.
There have been so many incredible stories from the 2023 Arctic Winter Games, which were the first in 5 years. Tonight's closing ceremony offering another chance to live up to the theme song, Time to Shine.
Wake up to the morning light, excited as I look outside.
And with the games wrapping up, so is our show for tonight. You've been listening to The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.